The twin suns bled fire across the barren sky, turning the sand into a shifting ocean of gold and white. Heat shimmered over the dunes, and the air carried the scent of scorched stone. At the edge of this endless desert stood the Baron's retinue, their cloaks snapping in the dry wind, their gleaming armor dulled by dust. The Baron himself towered above them all, his silhouette sharp and merciless against the horizon. His eyes were fixed not on the expanse before him but on the frail figure kneeling in the sand. The girl shivered under the sun, though the heat could have boiled blood. Her legs, twisted since birth, refused to hold her upright. A fine veil shielded her face, but even through the fabric her features showed the strain of her struggle. She raised her gaze to her father, and in that gaze lay questions she had asked 100 times but never spoken aloud. Why was she born broken, and why did he hate her so? The Baron did not speak to her. He never did. His words were for his guards, commands snapped with clipped precision. Leave her. The desert will finish what weakness began. No one dared to disobey. With practiced indifference, the armored men turned away. One by one they mounted their vehicles, engines roaring to life, throwing up curtains of sand as they vanished into the burning horizon. The girl remained alone, abandoned to the mercy of sun and silence. She pressed her palms into the sand and tried to drag herself forward, but the ground was merciless. Each movement skinned her hands and knees, and each breath scorched her lungs. She collapsed, the weight of despair pressing heavier than the heat. For the first time in her short life, there was no palace wall, no shadow of her father's looming contempt, only the unending sky above and the desert stretching to infinity. Hours slipped by like dying embers. Her lips cracked, her throat raw from thirst, and her eyes burned from salt and grit. She thought perhaps this was what her father had wanted all along, not merely her death, but her death in silence, with no one to witness, no one to remember. Her hands trembled as she tried to crawl again, but strength failed her, and she collapsed face-first into the sand. A crunch of boots disturbed the stillness. At first she thought it a mirage, some trick of delirium. But the steps grew louder, heavier, deliberate. A shadow fell across her broken form, blotting out the glare. Cale crouched beside her, his face half hidden beneath the folds of a desert scarf. His eyes, human and tired, scanned her quickly. Sunken cheeks, shallow breaths, skin already blistering from exposure. He could almost hear the desert claiming her, one heartbeat at a time. He muttered a curse under his breath, not for her but for fate itself. He knew exactly what she was, a daughter of the alien nobility, one of those who had ordered men like him to fight their wars and die in the dirt. He should have walked away. He did not. With a grunt, Cale slid an arm beneath her shoulders and lifted her upright. Her body was light, almost insubstantial, and heat radiated from her like an open furnace. Her eyes fluttered open, faint slivers of alien gold, and for a moment they locked with his. There was no arrogance in them, no disdain, only a hollow plea for life. "You'll die out here," he said, though his tone carried no sympathy, only fact. Her lips moved, but sound refused to form. Cale reached for the waterskin strapped to his side and pressed it gently to her mouth. She drank weakly, her throat convulsing at the sudden relief. He watched her with an expression caught between irritation and reluctant resolve. He had seen too many corpses in this desert, too many wasted lives. He did not want to add another to the tally. Cale hoisted her across his shoulders, her limbs dangling uselessly. The heat pressed down like a hammer, but his stride remained steady, purposeful. Each step sank deep into the sand, each breath dragged fire into his lungs, but he kept moving. The desert was his enemy, but he had learned long ago how to fight it, slow, patient, deliberate. The girl stirred once, whispering something too faint to catch. He paused, leaned closer, and heard the word, "Why?" Cale's jaw tightened. There was no easy answer. Because he was human. Because he had not yet surrendered the instinct to protect the weak. Because, unlike her father, he saw value where others saw only a burden. He did not voice any of these thoughts. Instead, he adjusted his grip on her and resumed his march, letting the silence serve as answer enough. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the dunes like long fingers. Cale's muscles burned, his throat begged for water, but he did not falter. He knew that night would bring cold sharp enough to split skin and winds fierce enough to strip flesh. They had to find shelter before darkness claimed the sky. At last, a jagged outcrop of stone emerged from the desert, a refuge carved by time and storms. Kale carried her into the hollow at its base, lowering her carefully against the cool rock. He pulled a cloak from his pack, wrapping it around her slight frame. She clung to it with trembling hands, the fabric her only defense against the falling night. Kale crouched opposite her, his eyes scanning the horizon for movement, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. He had no idea what awaited him now, trouble from her kin, vengeance from the Baron, or perhaps simply another battle with the desert itself. What he did know was that the girl's presence had already altered his path. Her eyes flickered open once more, luminous even in the dimming light. She studied him with quiet intensity, as if trying to decipher the man who had plucked her from death when her own blood had condemned her. Her lips parted, voice a hoarse whisper, fragile but clear. "You should have left me." Kale met her gaze, his expression unreadable, the lines of hardship etched deep into his features. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the sigh of wind across the dunes. Then he shook his head once, firmly, the decision already sealed. "No," he said. The desert swallowed the word, but its weight lingered. It was not the beginning of friendship, nor of trust, but it was the first stone laid on a path neither of them could yet see. And as the stars ignited across the vast sky, the man and the abandoned daughter sat in the hollow of the earth, bound by the single truth that neither had chosen but both would endure. The night gave no comfort, only a sharper cruelty. Cold winds slithered through the cracks of the stone hollow, and Kale fed a thin fire with brittle twigs until it glowed weakly against the dark. He sat with his back to the wall, watching the girl wrapped in his cloak. Her breathing was uneven, but each rise of her chest proved she still clung to life. He told himself he would leave her with the sunrise, deposit her at the nearest outpost if one could be found, and return to his solitary rhythm. Yet as he listened to the desert's long exhale, he knew he was lying to himself. Dawn came with knives of light across the dunes. Kale stirred her awake and gave her another swallow of water, careful not to waste a drop. She tried to sit but her legs refused, betraying her again. Frustration darkened her eyes, but he saw no self-pity there, only a bitter endurance. That look unsettled him more than tears would have. They began to move with the sun behind them. Kale walked steadily, carrying her when her arms gave out and letting her drag herself when pride demanded she try. He knew better than to fight her stubbornness outright. The desert did not forgive wasted strength, and she would learn soon enough that survival bowed to necessity. He rationed water by instinct, charted their path by stars remembered from soldiering days, and counted each dune like an enemy to be conquered. She asked no questions, but her gaze never stopped following his every movement, absorbing how he tested the sand with his boots, how he listened to the wind, how he tilted his head to mark the path of circling carrion birds. By the third day, her silence cracked. Her voice was low and raw. "You're not like the others." Kale kept his eyes on the horizon. "No reason to be. I'm human." She studied him, her brow furrowing. "Humans don't save us. They fight for coin, then die forgotten." He barked a short laugh, not of humor but recognition. "That's the story your kind tells. Mine's different." He said no more, but that night, when she pressed further, he spoke of his past with clipped words. He told her how he had marched under alien banners, promised honor that turned to ash. How his unit was sacrificed in a skirmish designed to buy the Baron's men time to retreat. How he crawled from a mound of his own dead while alien nobles called it strategy. She listened without interruption, her golden eyes reflecting firelight. When he fell silent, she whispered, "They call that honor. I called it cowardice even before I was left behind." Her words lingered with him longer than he cared to admit. Days stretched into a rhythm of survival. Kale hunted lean desert hares with traps, cracked cactus shells for water, and shielded her skin from sandstorms with layers of cloth. She proved quick of mind though her body failed her. When he misread a ridge and nearly led them into a salt flat, it was she who pointed out the faint shift of wind that meant mirages ahead. Her voice carried no pride, only calm certainty, as though observation were her only weapon and she had long ago learned to wield it well. He began to teach her deliberately. How to build a fire shielded from wind, how to track small footprints in loose sand, how to conserve breath when climbing. She struggled but never complained, her mind recording each lesson like scripture. He noticed how she turned questions back on him, demanding reasons, refusing to accept ritual without logic. When he explained, her understanding was swift, and her corrections sharper still. It unsettled him, but also impressed him. One evening, when the sky burned with twin sunsets, Kale returned from scouting to find she had arranged stones in a pattern at the cave mouth. It resembled a map, marking the ridges they had crossed. She traced lines with her finger, showing where wind currents shifted and where shadows promised shelter at certain hours. He crouched beside her, surprise flickering across his face. "You've been watching more than I thought." Her mouth curved into the faintest smile, not of joy but of triumph. "You taught me." I remembered. He studied her for a long moment. Weak in body, yes, but not in spirit. There was a clarity in her thinking, a precision that reminded him of field commanders he had once obeyed. Yet unlike them, she did not bark orders or cling to arrogance. She observed, processed, and adapted. The desert, indifferent as ever, tested them the next day with a storm that blotted out the suns. Kale dragged her beneath the cover of rock, bracing himself against the wind as sand scoured their skin like glass shards. Hours passed with the roar of nature threatening to bury them alive. She sat pressed to the wall, her hands white-knuckled but steady. When the storm broke, she did not collapse or weep. She asked only, how far to water? He gave her the truth, 3 days, if they did not falter. She nodded once, grim acceptance in her eyes. That night, he dreamed of comrades long gone, faces swallowed by dust. He woke with sweat freezing on his back, the echo of screams still in his ears. She was awake, watching him with quiet intensity. She did not ask about the nightmare, but her gaze spoke a question all the same. He turned from her, unwilling to answer, yet strangely relieved that someone had seen his weakness and not used it against him. By the 10th day, she no longer seemed the girl he had found half dead in the sand. Her body was no stronger, but her presence had grown sharper, her words more deliberate. She corrected his routes, calculated their rations, and noted which stars shifted with the seasons. He realized he had stopped thinking of her as baggage to be carried. She had become something else, an anchor, perhaps, or a mirror that showed him the man he was when stripped of bitterness. At sunset, when they shared the last of a rabbit roasted over coals, she broke the silence again. "You said you were human. What does it mean, to you?" Kale stared into the fire, the glow carving hard lines into his face. "It means we don't leave people to die alone, no matter how broken they are." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she closed them again, the words dissolving in thought. He saw her eyes glisten faintly in the firelight, not with tears but with something deeper, perhaps the first fragile seed of belief that her life might hold value beyond her father's scorn. The desert wind carried their silence into the night, but the space between them had changed. She no longer looked like a burden abandoned by cruelty. She looked like a mind waiting to be sharpened, and Kale found himself unwilling to imagine the road ahead without her walking it beside him, even if only in thought. The stars blazed cold and bright, the fire dwindled to embers, and though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the desert had ceased to be a place of ending. It had become the place where something new was being forged. The desert did not relent, but neither did Kale. Each sunrise brought with it another trial, and with each passing day the girl's transformation became more visible. Her body remained frail, her legs hopeless, but her mind sharpened like steel under a whetstone. He treated her not as fragile but as capable, and she responded with an intensity that surprised him. She memorized every lesson, questioned every assumption, and forced him to articulate strategies he had once relied on instinct alone to execute. In teaching her, he was forced to remember his own worth. One morning, as the heat began to gather its strength, he laid a length of twine in her hands. She examined it, waiting for explanation, and he crouched beside her with a small pile of stones. "A trap for hares," he said. "The desert offers little, but it offers enough if you know where to look. Show me how you'd use it." She studied the twine, then the stones, her eyes narrowing as she pieced together the design. Her first attempt was clumsy, her fingers unused to precision, but Kale corrected her with calm instruction. By evening, she had set her own snare. The next morning, the trap held a twitching hair, and her face lit with something more than relief. It was victory, the proof that she could take from the desert what it tried to deny her. Kale said nothing, only nodded once, but in his chest stirred a quiet pride he had thought buried years ago. Her progress spread beyond survival skills. At night she traced constellations with her finger, murmuring their names as Kale had taught her. Then, with a certainty that unsettled him, she began linking them into patterns of routes and strategies. She spoke of wind directions, shadow lengths, and water sources hidden beneath stone ridges. He realized she was mapping the desert not as an enemy to endure but as a battlefield to master. When he asked her how she saw these patterns, she tilted her head and answered simply, "Because I cannot run, I must see where to send others." The truth of it struck him harder than any weapon. She did not envy his strength. She sought to turn her weakness into vision. That night Kale could not sleep, haunted by the thought that her father had cast aside not a burden but a mind that might shape armies. Their bond drew others in time. Human wanderers, broken soldiers, and exiles crossed their path and found Kale already guiding someone who seemed to carry more authority in her stillness than many commanders in their shouting. They stayed, reluctant at first, but her quiet logic and Kale's unwavering grit gave them cause to follow. She listened to their tales, learned their skills, and wove their knowledge into plans that promised more than mere survival. Slowly, a small band formed around them, and though Kale remained the blade in the front, it was her words that shaped their direction. Kale watched all this with both pride and unease. He had always seen himself as a lone survivor, not a leader, but somehow he had become both mentor and shield to a girl others now began to treat as something greater. At night, when the campfires burned low, he caught himself studying her profile against the flames. Once broken, now resolute. Once abandoned, now the center of something larger than either of them had imagined. The desert tested them again when raiders came from the east, scavengers who lived on plunder and cared little whom they preyed upon. Kale led the defense, blades clashing beneath the searing sun. Yet when the dust settled, it was her plan that had spared them, the placement of sentries, the traps dug into the sand, the careful rationing of weapons. The raiders limped away beaten, and the humans who survived looked to her not with pity but respect. She did not bask in it, only nodded once and returned to studying the horizon. That evening, when Kale sat sharpening his blade, she spoke in the tone of one who had been thinking too long in silence. "If my father hears I live, he will come. Not for me, but to erase the shame of his failure." Kale glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Then we prepare." She met his gaze steadily. "We cannot meet him with strength. He has more soldiers, more machines. But the desert is ours now. We make it fight for us." There was no arrogance in her voice, no trace of the noble disdain he had once expected. Only calculation, the clear recognition of reality and the determination to bend it. Kale studied her for a long moment before nodding. She was right. He would fight with blade and grit, but it was her mind that would decide if they survived. The days that followed turned into drills. She directed men to build barricades from stone, to conceal paths with loose sand, to set traps where machines might stumble. Kale trained them in combat, relentless and exacting, yet always he returned to her for the greater design. Together they forged a plan that was more than defense, it was defiance. At times, Kale wondered if he was preparing her for survival or for war. Perhaps both. Either way, he could not deny what she had become. No longer the abandoned daughter left to die in the dunes, she was now the strategist at the heart of their fragile community, a voice that gave scattered men purpose. He knew the Baron would come eventually, and when he did, the desert would no longer greet him with silence. On a night when the stars burned especially bright, Kale found her awake, staring at the map she had etched into the sand. He crouched beside her, following the lines she had drawn. She looked at him then, her eyes sharper than he had ever seen them. "You gave me life when I had none," she said softly. "Now I will give you more than survival. I will give you victory." Kale said nothing, but the fire in her gaze told him everything he needed to know. She was no longer merely his burden or his student. She was the center of the coming storm, and he would stand with her until the last grain of sand turned red. The wind rose, carrying the scent of dust and distant thunder. The desert whispered of trials yet to come, and both of them listened, knowing the silence would not last. The horizon darkened with more than sand and heat. The Baron's banners cut across the dunes like a storm of steel, their columns moving with the precision of a conquering army. Dust rose in plumes as engines roared, alien soldiers advancing in gleaming ranks. From the outcrop where Kale and the others had prepared their defenses, the sight was both terrible and inevitable. He stood at the ridge, jaw set, while behind him the girl, no longer the frail shadow he had found in the desert, surveyed the approach with eyes that saw farther than any scout. "They come faster than I expected," she said, her voice calm, almost cold. Kale spat into the sand. "Good. Let them waste their strength on the desert before they waste it on us." The men gathered at her side, worn faces hardened by survival. They were not soldiers born but survivors remade, and it was not Kale alone they turned to. They listened as she laid out the final movements, each trap, each false trail, each hidden ambush. Her voice carried a quiet authority that bound them tighter than any oath. Even Kale, hardened by betrayal, found himself believing more fiercely than he had believed in years. The Baron's forces entered the valley at dusk. Shadows stretched long across the sand, concealing the snares she had designed. The first line of armored carriers sank into pits disguised with loose gravel, their engines screaming as men tumbled out into the killing ground. Panic spread through their order, and Kale struck like the blade he had always been, leading his fighters from the rocks. Steel clashed, sand burned under blaster fire, and the valley became a furnace of chaos. Through the fury, she remained seated on the ridge, her crippled legs bound in cloth, her gaze fixed on the battlefield. She called out signals to Kale, her mind charting every shift in enemy formation. Where they pressed too hard, she ordered retreat. Where they faltered, she urged advance. Her words reached him between breaths, and he obeyed without hesitation, his blade cutting the path she drew in her mind. The Baron rode at the rear, his armor gilded, his face a mask of disdain. When he saw her silhouette above the battlefield, recognition cut through him like ice. His shout carried across the valley. "Traitor child! You defile my bloodline with vermin." She did not flinch. Her eyes met his from across the chaos, steady, unbroken. For the first time in her life, she did not bow beneath his scorn. Kale carved his way toward the center, every strike driven by more than survival. The Baron had cast aside his own blood, had condemned Kale's comrades to death, had ruled with arrogance and contempt. Each swing of Kale's weapon was an answer to years of injustice. At last, the tide of soldiers thinned, and the path cleared until only Kale and the Baron remained, standing opposite each other in the dying light. The Baron drew a blade longer than Kale's arm, forged from alien alloys that shimmered with deadly promise. His movements were swift despite his size, honed by years of privilege and practice. Kale met him head-on, steel ringing out in sharp defiance. The duel became the eye of the storm, the clang of metal echoing across the valley while men bled and screamed around them. The Baron fought with precision, each strike calculated to crush. Kale fought with fury, each blow fueled by grit and memory. He bled from a dozen cuts, but he did not falter. He heard her voice in his mind, her lessons echoing patience, timing, calculation. For the first time, he fought not as a lone survivor but as half of something greater, guided by the mind that had turned despair into defiance. The Baron pressed hard, driving him back step by step, until Kale stumbled to one knee. The alien raised his blade high, eyes blazing with triumph. From the ridge came her voice, sharp as a command. "Now!" Kale rolled aside just as the Baron's foot struck ground softened by her earlier design. The sand collapsed, a pit concealed with precision, and the mighty alien staggered. Kale surged upward, driving his blade deep into the chink beneath the Baron's arm. The alien roared, strength shuddering out of him, and collapsed into the dust. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the wind. The Baron lay dying, his gaze fixed on his daughter. For the first time, his arrogance cracked, replaced by something colder, fear. She looked down upon him, not with hatred, not with joy, but with the quiet certainty of justice fulfilled. Kale stood over the fallen figure, chest heaving, blood streaking his arms. He looked to her, and she gave a single nod. It was not a command, not a plea, but a recognition that what had been broken was now whole. The Baron's breath rattled once, then ceased, and with it ended the shadow that had haunted her since birth. The surviving soldiers, once loyal to the Baron, dropped their weapons and fled into the dunes. The humans remained, their victory sealed not only by steel but by the will of one who had been left to die and had risen instead. She gazed at them, her frail body unmoving, yet none doubted who had guided their triumph. Cale walked to her side, lowering himself into the sand. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment neither spoke. The bond between them needed no words. She had seen his worth when he had carried her from the desert, and he had seen hers when she turned weakness into vision. Together, they had reshaped the fate that others had written for them. As the stars bled into the night sky, the desert lay quiet again, but its silence was no longer the silence of death. It was the silence of possibility, vast and waiting. The girl, once abandoned, now sat as a leader among those who had chosen to follow her. Cale remained at her side, the blade to her mind, the hand to her vision. The war was not over. Greater powers would hear of this defiance, and storms would gather again. But for this night, beneath the endless stars, they had proved a truth no noble blood could deny. Humanity's strength was not in perfection but in the refusal to bow, and in seeing worth where others saw none.